preview of China. Thank you. We run these occasional trade policy previews in tandem with the trade policy review of the WTO of the country involved. We've done a number, typically we do it for G20 countries. This is our first this year on China. These trade policy previews are meant to give participants a sense of the issues that are important for the trade and related policies of the country involved, and to prepare in some way the trade policy review itself. It is important to note that we do not have the Secretariat documents in preparation for the trade policy review, and I think that's appropriate. That gives us a fresh look at the situation. We do, however, have always have very important participants in the process, led by Simon Evenett, who is going to use the Global Trade Alert to brief us on major policy events in China. That he will be followed by Professor Tu, who is at the university in Beijing. And then we are lucky to have with us IIaria Mazzocco, who is in Washington. I anticipate that it will be a lively event. Chinese trade policy does excite people at the moment. Let me add one personal note. I was involved when I was at the Secretariat, I was involved in the first couple, actually, of trade policy reviews of China. The directors of the trade policy process in China at that time, the ones in the Ministry of Commerce, each of the ones that I was involved with subsequently went on to be ambassador here in Geneva, and 2 of them have become DGs. China takes this process seriously and assigns important resources to it. And I think that's a suggestion of the way they regard the WTO. The WTO is important to them. I think that will come through in the presentations this afternoon, but also what will come through are some of the tensions that are presently associated with Chinese trade policy. I'm going to give the floor, I'm going to stay out of the way most of the time. I'm going to give the floor first to Simon, who was about to move to the University of Lausanne, IMD, and who founded the Global Trade Alert, is going to give us a very serious detailed presentation and a very good presentation on Chinese trade policy. I'm going to allow him the floor for essentially as long as he wishes, but I anticipate it'll be 20 to 30 minutes that he'll take. And then I will turn to Professor Tu. At that particular time, perhaps Lou, who is the CEO of FMG, will be here, and he might be able to come in as well at some time in commenting on the trade policy. And then, all importantly, to IIaria as a discussant and her own views. I'm now going to give the floor directly to Simon, who's going to give us a PowerPoint presentation. Simon, it's yours.
Thank you, Clem. I'm just going to go to raise my slides. For the colleagues, you can see that my slides have a QR code in the top corner. If you want to grab the slide deck, then just simply scan the QR code and you should immediately get the full copy of these slides. That's if you wish to follow them and keep a copy for yourself. All right, my goal here is to provide an overview of some of the key trade policy questions which have arisen since China's last TPR. I will divide my presentation into 3 parts. I will talk about the trade and capacity utilization outcomes in recent years, since this has been the subject of much commentary. Then I will turn to China's trade policy since its last TPR, and then I will raise some questions that this evidence seems to suggest to me. I will not talk about the extensive annexes which I've put at the end of this presentation. You may find there's useful information there on China's trade policy stance as it is at the moment overall, not just what has happened since the last TPR. China's digital policy developments, and also the stake that China has within the trading system. I've also included an annex on how much information is available on China's trade policies when you compare it to other G20 countries, and this might help speak to the important question of the availability of information in the first place. But I will not talk to those annexes unless I'm asked to in Q&A. Let me turn then to the first section, which is to discuss the trade and capacity utilization outcomes in recent years. There has been, as you know, a narrative which has developed that China has substantial excess capacity, which is then being potentially shipped onto world markets. Some people would say dumped. And so what I'd like to do at the outset is to consider these arguments. I'm going to summarize my main findings on this slide. The first is that unlike previous years, we have some people contending that there is systemic excess capacity in China, not sectoral excess capacity. And I want to look at the evidence of this. I'm not particularly persuaded by the former arguments. I'm persuaded that there are some sectors where there are excess capacity and where we have traditionally used certain tools to, quote, fix that problem. So first, I'll address the current narrative and debate using evidence to try and sort through what is fact and what is fiction. Then I'm going to point to a problem which I see in the Chinese supply side, which I do think is something which is worthy of discussion. It's not a unique problem to China, but China has a particular problem of loss-making firms which seem to somehow survive year in, year out, which is not what one would expect in a functioning capitalist economy or competitive capitalist economy. Then I'm going to turn to the trade flows that we've seen and to examine the question just how export dependent China has been. And we will see that there are significant changes over time in this, which I'd like to discuss and which I think provide important context for this current debate we're having on China's economic structure and its consequences for the rest of the world. This will involve me talking about the evolution of Chinese export volumes and export prices. And I would conclude then with a discussion about the recent Chinese export surge. And I'm going to link it not to excess capacity, but actually to competition for market share within East Asia, where China competes quite aggressively with other developing countries. So this summarizes the arguments I will make in the next few slides. Just to ground the debate, we have claims that China has systemic excess capacity. Not just sectoral overcapacity, systemic excess capacity. And this is a new critique, or so it appears. Two advocates of this position are described on this slide here. Perhaps the most interesting position is articulated by Secretary Yellen, who argues that China has macroeconomic imbalances, a savings rate which is too high, and this is leading to products being shipped onto world markets, and industrial policies are channeling savings to high levels of investment in some sectors, leading to excess capacity. A similar claims are made by the Rhodium Group, although they are careful to say that not all of this excess capacity is currently on the world markets. There is more to come. Now, for those of us who, when you look at Secretary Yellen's comments, the first sentence is the most telling because comments about countries having macroeconomic imbalances and excess of savings over investment these are comments which we've heard made about Japan and about Germany in the G7 context for almost decades. And so in that sense, this systemic capacity critique has the smell of old wine in new bottles. There is a twist here, of course, which is the suggestion that the consumption has been suppressed in China and that industrial policies have led to expansion in capacity. Now, of course, there's a contradiction in this argument because if the macroeconomic imbalances are a function of savings being far greater than investment, the very industrial policies which are being criticized increase investment, and that should actually reduce the imbalances. But never mind this macroeconomic slip by the Secretary of the Treasury. So you can see here that this is a case, in my view, of old wine in new bottles. But what does the data actually say? When you look at aggregate manufacturing capacity utilization rates for China compared to the 5 G7 countries which produce such data, China's numbers are indeed below at present those of other countries, but not markedly below. And if you look back over the past 3 years, one doesn't see too much difference between the Chinese numbers and those of the G7 countries which are listed here. Generally, numbers for capacity utilization lie between 70 and 85. And this is where most countries are. Readings below 70, are typically signs of worry. So at least at the aggregate level, it's a bit hard to say that there is a major capacity utilization difference in manufacturing between China and these 5 industrialized countries. When you look over time, and you compare the evolution of Chinese capacity utilization rates in manufacturing and in certain key sectors, as I've done on slide number 7, you can see that since the last TPR, there is a slight decline in Chinese manufacturing capacity utilization, but it is not in any way taking us below 70% for aggregate manufacturing. So we're nowhere near the sort of danger zone. However, there are some sectors which do dip below 70% from time to time. And notice, though, that those dips are very quickly reversed, which strongly suggests that it's unwise to make inferences based on 1 quarter or 1 month's data. And unfortunately, that's exactly what a lot of the media is currently doing. Now, notwithstanding these observations, I do think if you look carefully into the solar panel sector, as some of my team has done, also somewhat in EVs and a little bit in steel, you can see that there are some sectors where there appears to be excess capacity at the moment. And also, of course, countries are taking measures against those imports if they feel that's appropriate. So I would conclude from this that China doesn't have a system, or at least from this data, that China doesn't have a systemic excess capacity problem, but it probably does have excess capacity in some sectors which are being addressed by trading partners in a traditional manner. So this would be my assessment of where this excess capacity discussion is going and how, in some sense, it's not particularly new. One point I would like to bring to your attention, and this is a work that I have done with another one of my teams, is that where China appears to have a problem is in loss-making firms that do not seem to turn around. Let me explain the background here. It's quite normal in capitalist economies for investment to run ahead of demand. And when firms miscalculate and overinvest, they start making losses. And in a properly functioning capitalist system, we should see either the firm come under pressure from its shareholders, or the firm would be taken over, or the firm might exit. What we should not see is firms destroying value and making losses for year after year after year, unless they're being propped up by something. What my colleagues and I did, looking across 40,000 publicly listed firms since 2005, is to identify the firms in 21 economies which were destroying value between 2010 and 2014. And in the case of China, there were 560 publicly listed firms of this nature. And then we asked how many of them were still making losses 8 years later in 2022. And the percentages on this chart show you the number of firms that were still making losses 8 years later. And there's huge variation across countries. We see in the case of the Netherlands that no firm that was making losses in 2010 to 2014 was still making losses in 2022, suggesting a quite serious corrective market mechanism. Whereas in contrast, we see at the other end of the schedule, of the table, China has the 32% of its firms which were losing money in 2010 to 2014 were still losing money in 2022, which suggests that there's the corrective mechanism we expect in capitalism is being frustrated somewhat. Just so you get some sense of the scale of this problem, the cumulative losses associated with the firms which were making losses in 2010 to 2014, by 2022, they had made a total of $192 billion worth of losses, which is not trivial. So something must be propping these firms up unless private investors think these firms are going to turn around. So what I would suggest is that rather than having a discussion about excess capacity, maybe it would be better to have a discussion with our Chinese colleagues and with colleagues in other countries which appear to have a similar problem too, about why is it that loss-making firms are not turning themselves around? Is there something wrong with the bankruptcy code? Is there something wrong with the corporate governance code? Are there pressures of competition not insufficiently strong? Maybe a discussion about these matters, about how we turn around firms that have overinvested and get them to pull back, is the right conversation to have, rather than just pointing to excess capacity. Now, I would suggest that this is actually a better conversation to have, because there's very good analysis done by many international organizations on these very policies. And of course, this is a subject which does not affect just China. If we look on this data here, France, Malaysia, Indonesia, Switzerland, South Africa, Japan, and Korea and Italy have 20% of their or more of their publicly listed firms, which were making losses a decade ago, we're still making them in 2022. So this is not a China-specific problem. It seems to be a problem which we have in many countries, and this might merit, therefore, a more systemic discussion. So I would have a discussion about this particular matter rather than the overcapacity matter. Turning now to China's overall export performance, and here I would draw from Richard Baldwin's work. What Richard has shown is that since the global financial crisis, we can see on the right-hand side that domestic sales in China have risen much faster than export sales. As a result, we see on the left-hand side the number of firms that are in Chinese manufacturing that are exporting has fallen from 37% in 2006 to 25% just before the pandemic. And you'll see here a convergence of Chinese behavior to that of the United States. That comes through when one carefully calculates the export to production ratios. And you can see on the left-hand side here that there was a period where China was becoming more and more dependent on foreign markets for demand. This was a period which peaked around the global financial crisis. And since then, we then find that China is actually been diminishing its export dependence on the rest of the world and converging down to levels not too different from the United States. So this takes you up to the pandemic era and suggests that, any claims that China's economic model is inherently addicted to export demand is somewhat misplaced when we look at the data. What has happened since the pandemic is captured in the next few slides. We can see that China's export volumes have grown much faster than the other industrialized countries in the rest of the world. This data comes from the World Trade Monitor outfit, which is a public sector outfit in Copenhagen. And you can see that the export volumes of China have bounced back since the pandemic, and this may well be the cause of concern. Now, often people argue that this export volumes were driven by China cutting export prices systematically. But when we look at the export price index data, we find that actually Chinese export prices have risen faster than that of industrialized countries in the rest of the world as well. So China's gains of market share have not been driven by substantial export price reductions, which goes against the sort of pervasive systemic dumping narrative that one is hearing from certain quarters. So this takes us through to the current day. I want to turn now to one last phenomenon, which I think is worth thinking about if you're going to try and understand China's recent export behavior. And that is to realize that China competes against East Asia, or at least developing countries in East Asia, for market share. And what I've reproduced in this chart here, again from the World Trade Monitor, is the evolution over time in red in China's export prices, and in black, the export prices of the rest of emerging Asia, except China. And you can see in general, the two export prices move together, but there are important points of divergence. And one of the most important points of divergence is the last few months, where you see China's export prices falling considerably compared to that of East Asia. And now you'll notice if you look back in earlier phases, whenever the Chinese economy has got into trouble, that is 2008 and 9, 2015 and 16, China's export prices have fallen. But often in what's happened in those two previous instances, East Asian export prices actually fell more. What's unusual this time round is that East Asian developing countries have maintained their prices and China has cut its export prices. So the ratio of the two has shifted against China towards emerging markets in East Asia. And that's what's shown by the green line, which shows the evolution in the average export prices of China compared to the rest of East Asia. The dip in the green line at the end shows you just how much China's export prices have fallen. This is important when we now draw in what's happening with export volumes. And this is the point I want to show on this chart. The red line shows you the evolution in relative export prices that I showed you on the last chart. The blue chart shows you East Asia's export volumes compared to that of China. And look at the period from 2020 onwards. What we saw was a sharp shift when the pandemic hit towards sourcing from China. And of course, we sourced lots of medical equipment and manufactured goods from China at that time. China's market share increased considerably. Then from 2021 to 2023, maybe because we're sourcing less from China, maybe because we were encouraging firms to de-risk from sourcing from China, East Asia's market share catches up. So the line reverses in direction. And you can see that as the East Asian market share goes up and China's goes down, at some point the Chinese react to this to try and restore their market share by cutting their own export prices. So what this looks like to me is that the export growth from China is driven in large part by competitive factors and shifts in demand in the rest of the world. It's got nothing to do with underlying excess capacity questions. It has a lot to do with the battle for market share between China and its East Asian rivals. And seen this way, then, I think you get a different interpretation about what's driving China's export performance. You do not need to tell an elaborate story about China's underlying economic structure and system in order to tell a story about competition like this. But there is a twist, of course. You might ask yourself the question, how is it that these Chinese firms can afford to lower their export prices? And are they being subsidized to do so? And that's a question we may want to come back to. So in this first section then, hopefully by going through the evidence on capacity utilization rates and on export prices and export volumes, I provided you with a fact-driven interpretation about these or assessment of the debate on excess capacity and why so much of it seems to be at odds with what's actually going on the ground. Having done this, I will now turn to the evolution of China's trade policy since its last TPR. And here I will summarize the main findings. Here I will draw principally from the global trade alert data for the first 5 points. The last point I'll talk about separately. So what we found is that since the last TPR has been put in place, the measures that China has put in place which favor local firms cover 90% of its good imports. And the measures which favor foreign firms, which liberalize Chinese markets, cover around 15% of Chinese imports. So there is a big gap there. We find that subsidies to local firms dominate the market access changes since the last TPR. And we've documented a total of 1,652 subsidies to local-based firms or subsidy schemes, which underlie this particular finding. And we identify a subsidy scheme or a subsidy award. We identify the firms which are beneficiaries, the products involved, and that enables us to calculate the trade coverage. We identified that there are 16 Chinese trading partners which have more than $20 billion of goods at risk or export at risk, which have been taken, they're at risk from measures taken since the last TPR by China. And Latin America and China's Northeast Asian neighbors are highly exposed to these Chinese measures, which have been taken since 2021. The sectors which China has favored do not appear to have changed that much since the last TPR. So these are all the findings which are based on the independent global trade alert monitoring of Chinese measures. I have one last observation which comes from the EPING database. There is an interesting shift in behavior of imports covered by notified TBTs since the last TPR, which I'll highlight to you at the end. So the first chart I want to show you is that if we went back to the 22nd of October 2021, when China's TPR was over, last TPR was over, and we tracked over time the implementation of all the new measures which benefit Chinese firms at the expense of foreign firms, we would find that over time, the share of Chinese imports covered rose to 90% and almost 95%. So you can see here that even since the last TPR, the subsidy schemes have essentially been delivered to firms in just about every sector where China faces import competition. In contrast, the liberalizing measures which have been put in place by China cover around 15%, and that share has grown, but there's clearly a gap between these two lines. When we look at the liberalizing measures and the market access improvements that we've seen since the last Chinese TPR, they are mainly a function of tariff reductions and import licensing restrictions being relaxed and some import quotas being reduced. They're not due to subsidy reductions. In contrast, when we look at the market access risks since the last TPR, these are dominated by subsidies to import competing firms. The dark blue line, which covers all of the measures and the trade covered by all of the measures, overlaps almost entirely with the dark brown line, which is the share of imports into China, which are covered by subsidies to local firms. And you can see here that it's a subsidy-driven story backed up with some import licensing and import quota measures as well. So this gives you a sense of how the market access changes have unfolded since the last TPR. If we look and we break this down by developing country group and by industrialized country group on the left-hand side, we can see how those charts would have unfolded for different groups of developing countries. And here we see that Latin America stands out in terms of its exposure to Chinese harmful measures taken since the last TPR. And on the right-hand side, Japan stands out as being particularly exposed to Chinese measures. But of course, the other countries are exposed considerably as well. When we look at which countries have seen the most exports at risk, we can estimate, we can go country by country looking at all of the goods that they export and are they exporting in 6-digit HS codes, which China is importing where there is a trade distortion on the Chinese side. And we can find the countries where there's more than $20 billion of trade at stake. And you can see that the three biggest affected, the three most exposed trading partners are in Northeast Asia, and the United States comes fourth. When it comes to the sectors which are affected by Chinese measures, the sectors which are covered by Chinese measures which benefit local firms, if you calculate the share of each of the harmful measures which affect each sector, and you compare what was the case at the last TPR with the current TPR, these shares are pretty much the same. There is little change in the shares which are favored by China. So there's no big shift in favor of one particular sector or away from other sectors. So the pattern seems to be relatively stable. The last chart I have then comes not from the Global Trade Alert database, but from the EPING database. And here what we've done is year by year, go and see which measures China has notified, which are TBT measures, and then calculated what's the share of Chinese imports in each year covered by new TBT measures. And you'll see from 2015 through to the last TPR, every year China was notifying TBTs which covered more and more of Chinese imports. Now, in principle, these regulations could be entirely non-discriminatory, but they could still be costly to comply with. Yet something strange happens with the TBT notifications in 2022. They seem to cover far fewer amounts of Chinese imports. Now, that could be because there are fewer notifications or there are fewer HS codes attached to those notifications. And again, this would be worth exploring why there is a difference here. Could it be a change in underlying regulatory behavior, or is there something else going on? We see a lower level in 2023 than in 2021 as well. So there appears to be something on the TBT side which is unusual and worth perhaps asking our Chinese colleagues about. Let me then suggest 6 questions which arise from this particular presentation. So the first question is, China is currently undergoing stimulus policies to try and revitalize the economy, get the growth rate back up again. The suggestion has been that in promoting manufacturing and therefore exports, China's export dependence will be growing again. But this, of course, goes against the dual circulation strategy and the progress that we saw from the global financial crisis. So what do we learn from this? Is this is the current stimulus package undercutting the dual circulation strategy, or are there limits to the degree to which China is going to reduce its export dependence? The second question relates to the dual circulation strategy that China has, and if it's pursuing this strategy, then what contribution does openness now play in the Chinese development model, and what type of commercial engagement can we expect from China going forward if the strategy that China has been pursuing is continued? The third question has to do with overcapacity, and it should be said that China has taken public steps in the past to try and reduce overcapacity in trade-sensitive sectors. And it would be interesting to learn from our Chinese colleagues, what did they learn from those previous initiatives, and whether any of those initiatives are worth repeating at this time. A fourth question arises from the evidence I showed you on firms which seem to sustain losses. What steps can be taken to turn around or encourage the exit of firms that cannot get themselves out of loss making? And is there any relationship then between these measures to discipline firms to get them out of loss making and Chinese industrial policy? The fifth question I would ask is, there is, of course, concerns about the level of transparency about Chinese corporate subsidies. We have to use the WIN database to document a lot of the subsidies which Chinese firms report receiving. And I would ask the question whether the current levels of transparency are serving Chinese interests, or whether it would be time to supply more of this information and so as to be in a way which is credible and so influence how China's subsidy policies are perceived. And the last question is, it's very clear when we've looked at China, a lot of the action that we see in commercial policy involves China using subsidies. But what other non-subsidy related reforms to the business environment could be used to improve competitiveness and to improve the performance of Chinese firms? So do we need to rely so much on subsidies, or could there be other measures which could help improve the competitiveness of the Chinese economy in ways that may not be such a concern for trading partners? Thank you, Clem, and I'll hand back the floor.
It took me I'm sorry, it took me a moment to unmute. I'm in the same room as Simon, which is causing a bit of a problem, echo problem. Thank you, Simon. You've given us an awful lot to think about. I'm particularly intrigued by the loss-making firms. And I'm charmed, as it were, by the fact that the Netherlands, I'm Dutch, is at 0%. I'm going to go with, there's been a lot of food for thought in Simon's presentation, and I'm going to go with that directly to Professor Tu, who is in Beijing, and he has a presentation for us on these very questions. Professor Tu, the floor is all yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Clemens. And I'm sorry, actually, I'm right now in the airport, so I'm sorry that maybe there will be some background noise. Let me share my PPT. So share. Okay, can you see it?
Yes, we can see it. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to Simon for your very comprehensive presentation. I have learned your PPT before this event. It's quite comprehensive, and I believe that you have raised a lot of difficult questions. And also, I think your views are basically balanced. And thanks for your explanations also. Okay, so I would like to make some compliments and share a few of my observations. In my opinion, actually, since the last TPR, the biggest challenge for China is actually the macroeconomic development. We are really facing significant challenges. So you can see in the last few years, the economic growth is very bumpy, has been very bumpy, largely because of the pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic, but also some other policy changes and the external environment changes. So actually in China, inside China, we don't talk much about trade, but we are very concerned about the macroeconomic stability and the deceleration of economic growth. So you can see largely since 2009, the annual GDP growth rate has been declining. And in recent couple of years, it's very unstable. Another thing is you can see from this chart, actually, since 2008, the share of final consumption expenditure in GDP had been climbing quickly, actually, but until 2019, 2020, the trend has been reversed. So right now, and as I said, inside China, a lot of discussions about the declining consumption. So this has caused a lot of troubles for us. It also caused the declining price. As Simon mentioned, the export price has been declining in recent years because inside China, I mean, domestically, the price is also declining. So the consumption, structural consumption behavior of Chinese consumers has changed significantly in recent couple of years. So then the result in terms of in macroeconomic terms is that the share of consumption has been declining, and also as mentioned by Simon, the share of exports actually in China's economic growth had been declining, but in recent years it has some changes also. So this is, I think, the biggest trouble for us. And my explanation is that I have some explanation, my personal explanations for this kind of change. The first one, of course, is the pandemic has had a significant impact on the income and expenditure of households. Of course, this is an unexpected external factor. But there were also some policy measures making this change. Actually, you know that China's pandemic control policy was very strict, and it has had a significant impact on the economic behavior of consumers and producers and households. So the influence is actually much bigger than we thought. And also in the last few years, the Chinese government initiated some regulatory reforms in the real estate, online education, internet service industries. These policies, along with the pandemic control, created huge disruptions. In particular on consumptions, because like for example, you know that the Chinese housing market has had a significant changes in the last few years, mainly because of the government policies. And the purpose actually of the government is to calm down the market, because in 2021, the housing price was rocketing again. Then even more you could say the strictest control policy was imposed on the real estate. And as I said, the purpose was to control, to calm down the market. Now the market is really calmed down. But the unexpected result is that we basically believe that housing market is more about investment. Right now, the investment in the housing market has declined significantly. But another impact of this change is on consumption, because Chinese households spend more than half, I think, on the housing behavior or activities related to the housing, on furniture, on electrical appliances, and all these other things. So actually, in the past, the biggest share of consumption for Chinese people, for Chinese household is related to the housing market. So as I said, the cooling down of housing market does not only reduce investment, but also reduce consumption. So this is I think this was not expected by the government. And another significant shock is the decline of population since 2022, I think. It also has very significant psychological influence on Chinese people. So in the past, we always believe that the housing market will be rising always because China has a huge population. But suddenly, we are seeing that the population has reached the highest, and the population will decline forever, definitely. So it has, as I said, it has unexpected, huge psychological influence, also on the housing market, and also on education, consumption, and other consumption behaviors. And also the collapse of housing market has a negative impact not only on households but also on the government. So recently, many local governments have significant troubles with their revenue. So just recently, there are many news coverage about so-called tax, not tax rebate, but tax repayment. Which means that the authority is trying to get more tax payment from the firms, causing a lot of also troubles. So anyway, as I said, I think the impact of the collapse of housing market was not expected fully. And another thing is external problems. So as I said, the external pressure, the growing security concerns over external pressure and the threat have also created a lot of impacts or shocks. One big, I would say, one big influence is that the government imposes even higher emphasis on the production and the supply side, especially in the development of manufacturing. So the government believes that the manufacturing is critical for defense of national security. So production is more important. We know that consumption is important for macroeconomic development, but production is critical for defense of national security. So then, in terms of priority, national security is higher. So I mean, in terms of balancing the two targets, the focus, the priority is imposed on the supply side. Then this has some external influence or spillover effect. So as I said, you can see the share of manufacturing actually had been declining since 2008 until 2020, because as I said, the consumption was also rising, and the consumption was more about services, not more about manufactured goods. But since 2020, also partly because of the pandemic, but also because of the growing concerns about security. So more emphasis, as I said, more emphasis, more resources were put on the supply side, put on manufacturing. So you can see the share of manufacturing in the GDP has been rising again in the last few years. And this, as mentioned by Simon, has resulted in higher concerns by our trading partners about China's so-called overcapacity or higher exports. This actually has been shown by Simon. So you can see, because, as I said, because of course we have really good capabilities and I'd say better technologies. So the share of Chinese manufacturing in the world has been climbing for a long time, But you can see there are a few years the share was lower. But again, in recent years, the share has started to rise again. So, as I said, there are some new changes in the recent couple of years. And in terms of trade, also as mentioned by Simon, actually the significance, the importance of trade for China had been declining since 2007 or 2008. But again, in recent years, the share of trade in GDP has been climbing again, has been rebounding again. So this is kind of systematic changes in trade, in manufacturing, in consumption. So they are, I think they are connected with each other. But in terms of the total share of China in world merchandise exports has been relatively steady. But compared with like 2019, 2018, there is some increase, not that significant. But so you can see in 2023, the share has been is lower than 2020 already. So I mean, there are some changes occurring at the same time. Actually, another thing I think I should mention is that one significant change is more and more Chinese companies are investing overseas, moving their production capability overseas. This, I think, is also very obvious. We're moving to Southeast Asia, Mexico, India, and Latin America. So in the relative term, I think the shock of Chinese exports is how to say is not significant as imagined. Then another information I would like to offer is that in terms of the geographical structure, the dependence of China on the traditional market of Big Four, so-called US, EU, Chinese Hong Kong, and Japan, has been declining quickly, arguably. You can say from 2020 to 2023, the share has declined from 48.6 to 42.4. So I think this is also very, very important structural change. We are diversifying our exports destination. One purpose is actually to reduce the external pressure, because as you all know, another thing is, as I said, Chinese companies are investing overseas. So there are more and more intermediate goods trade between China and those investment destination countries, like Southeast Asia, especially, and also Latin America, Africa, or these countries, so-called Belt and Road Initiative countries. So to some extent, I would say that China's impact, or the impact of China's exports on the developed countries will be gradually declining. This is and in terms of Chinese trade policy development in the last few years, I have kind of maybe different impression, at least, from Simon. Of course, I know that Simon has a very great database, GTA. We don't have so much information, but as I said, according to my observations, of course, on the policy development of China in the last few years, I would say basically we have initiated a lot of, implemented a lot of liberalizing policies. So again, as I said, this is a little bit different from Simon's observation. So, for example, there are examples. Further reducing tariffs. This is, of course, obvious. Now, the overall average tariff level is 7.3%, lower than our bound tariff rate. And also, China is not an active user of trade remedies, with only 3 anti-dumping investigations in the last 3 years, in comparison to 107 of the United States and 104 of India. So I think China is very, very conservative in this sense. And also we are trying to improve trade facilitation. You can see there are some observations. You can see the average overall customs clearance time for imports and exports in China decreased by 67% and 91% from those in 2017. We have really invested a lot in trade facilitation. And also, China is relaxing data flow regulation. Of course, I know that China has very strict data flow regulation, but there are new changes. In March this year, China issued the provisions on promoting and regulating the cross-border flow of data, which optimize and adjusts the data export regimes, which is very welcome by foreign companies, especially. And China is also easing market access for foreign investment. China has abolished market access restrictions in automobile manufacturing and realized zero restriction in the negative list for foreign investment access in the field of manufacturing. And one significant policy is that in the last year, China optimized the policies on visa and the foreigners' stay and the residence. we have offered a unilateral visa-free policy to dozens of countries. Now I think over 50 countries. This I think is a great change, very, very welcome by so many countries. And also, again, as I said, this is a unilateral liberalization. There also, I think you know that China also has implemented a lot of unilateral liberalization policies in those so-called pilot zones. Maybe they are not that significant, but it's also a signal. And in terms of WTO policy, you may know that in September last year, a group study session was held by China's top leaders, China's Politburo, on WTO rules and WTO reform, during which President Xi emphasized that China firmly safeguards the WTO. So this is actually the first one on this kind of so-called group study session focusing on WTO, and especially WTO reform. So I think this clearly indicates China's emphasis on the WTO. And also in the WTO negotiations, China submitted and co-sponsored dozens of proposals to modernize the WTO in the MC12 and MC13. And also as a responsible developing member, China pushed for pragmatic outcomes on development issues at MC13. On investment facilitation, I think China is a leading member on this issue. And also China made new achievements in FTA negotiations with several trading partners. And also, maybe I would like to make a few responses to Simon's comments also. I know that there are a lot of discussions about so-called overcapacity in some industrial sectors, especially in new energy sector. My own opinion that this is basically exaggerated and sometimes misled. So I would say, to some extent, overcapacity is a phrase used by the Chinese government to deal with some difficulties faced by state-owned enterprises in the last decades since the market reform. Because usually in terms of competitiveness, SOEs are not comparable to private companies. So then in many industries, there will be some periodical overproduction. I wouldn't like to use the overcapacity, overproduction, but because they are both SOEs and private companies competing in the same market, in the same industry. And in terms of SOEs, they would be more difficult to leave the market. So they will sustain their production capacity. But at the same time, private companies are more competitive and more efficient. So they are also producing more. So in total, there will be overproduction in this market. So then for the government, the major task for them is for the government is to deal with the difficulties of SOEs in the market competition. So then the government will sometimes call for so-called reduction of production capability, and it happened many times in these a number of industries like textiles, steel, electrical appliance, shipbuilding, coal, automobile. But actually, in the new energy industry, the government hasn't at least pay much attention to this overcapacity issue yet. So actually, I mean, you may know that in Chinese new energy industry, the most competitive companies, again, are private companies. Like in the EV industry, the most competitive companies are like BYD, Xiaomi, NIO, and those SOEs, even they have joint ventures with foreign companies, they are failing the market. They are failing the market. So again, this situation of so-called overproduction or overcapacity happen again, because both the kind of demising part and the rising part coexist at the same time in the market. So periodically there will be overproduction or overcapacity. But according to the history of many other industries, this problem will disappear after a while, because those less efficient companies will leave the market. As I said, it has happened in many industries, like in cell phones, in electrical appliances, in textiles, and also some other industries. So we just need some time to wait for this happening again in the new energy industry. But of course, it will result in some instability and also maybe disruptions in the market. Actually, you know, right now, these state-owned car companies are facing significant challenges. It has caused a big trouble for some cities, even, like for Guangzhou, for Shanghai. They are facing big problems because they have state-owned car makers, but they are less efficient than private companies in EVs. So this is, I think this is just a problem of market competition. Not only in new energy industry, but also in other industries. It will happen again. So, and I agree with actually with Simon that there is no systematic so-called overcapacity problem. But one response to the question raised by Simon is the so-called the sustained loss-making, right? Loss-making companies, why they could survive a long time. I think this could have some Chinese characteristics, because you know that China's social welfare system is not so well developed, well established yet. So the government, especially local governments, will be very concerned about the bankruptcy of important companies in that area, in that city, or in that province. So the local governments would try to help those companies survive for a long time, to smooth the process of the decline of that company or that specific company or specific industry. So they will provide some subsidies or help. But again, as I said, I don't think that this is kind of production subsidies. This is kind of social welfare subsidies. It is mainly for social stability, or you could consider it as a social safety network policy. It's not a, but I would not deny that there will be any something like that. But basically, I would say these subsidies or these helps are trying to slow down the process of the demise of that specific industry or company. And also, according to the chart of Simon, you can see that some countries have, of course, China has the highest. Sorry, I couldn't find this. Anyway, I have a little doubt about the how to say, the meaning of this indicator, because as you indicated in this chart, India and Russia have very low, right? In this sense, they have very low indicator in this sense. But does that mean they are more market driven, even more market driven than United States or Netherlands? Not Netherlands. I just I couldn't remember. But anyway, I don't think this indicator is so indicative in terms of a market economy. So I think I should stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Xinquan. We're beginning to run a little bit short of into a time constraint, so I'm going to, without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to IIaria. She is at the CSIS and was recently involved with a major study on estimating Chinese industrial policy spending. IIaria, it's up to you.
Thank you so much. This was such an interesting conversation. I'm so glad I got to be, I was invited to this, and it's a real honor to be able to comment on such expertise. I will also say the study is no longer recent. It was done 2 years ago. So at this point, I think probably due for a revamp. I'm going to just I'm going to be very brief because I want to leave some time for discussion, and I know we're running a little bit over time. There were many very interesting points that came up. I think I'll just identify a few that might be interesting for deeper discussion. One is that I think I agree that the systemic overcapacity narrative is a bit of a red herring, right? Because it gets us into this very complex, I think, as Simon said, I think it gets us into this quite complex elaborate conversation about consumption levels, etc. But I do agree that this is really what it's actually pointing at, or where the conversation would be more valuable, is the subsidy or the failure of companies to exit the market side of things. And of course, I do recognize, as Professor Tu says, that you may have subsidies for a variety of reasons, including social welfare. But those subsidies still have a very big impact on trade. And so I think they still can be highly problematic, or at least create a lot of tensions, which is, I think, what we're seeing now. And I think, the other side of things is, I think, rather political, right? There was the slide that Professor Tu showed where, China is, we're all familiar with it, where like China represents 35% of global manufacturing. And I think just ultimately a world where everything is made in China is just not going to be politically sustainable to most countries in the world. And that's where, I don't want to get too deep into the micro side of things, which is actually more of my expertise. But, I think when you look at things, sectors like the electric vehicles or steel, I think you're just seeing a lot of trade defense tools being deployed by a variety of countries, which I think reflects a broader discomfort with some of the trends at play. Now, I think you can go back and forth on the sort of factory capacity utilization. I agree that's actually probably not very productive, and that's where I point that I think it was very valuable of Simon to point to the focus on why companies don't fail in China. I think another very valuable point is the data transparency issue, and I think we do have sort of a trust issue at the moment. I actually think it's a quite a very dangerous moment for institutions like the WTO, because trust, at least in the US, is at all times low, I think, in these types of institutions. And I think there needs to be some sort of like trust building efforts on all parts that may also include more data transparency on government spending in terms of state support or other sort of perceived trade distorting measures. I think one final observation, which it might be worth spending a little more time on, is that as Professor Tu pointed out in his presentation, you do have sort of growing security concerns that are driving more investment in manufacturing. And that is not a unique Chinese trend. That is a trend you're seeing in a lot of different countries. It's part of that sort of de-risking and economic security approach that you're seeing even in the United States or Europe. And it does, I think, is risk getting us into sort of a vicious circle of sorts, or maybe we're already quite well into that. And I think that's just worth taking a closer look at, or at least keeping in mind that that trend is well underway. I think at one last point on the sort of private versus SOE in China and like how the market needs time to adjust. I think ultimately when you're looking at companies like NIO, which I think was pointed out to be like a successful private company, it received a pretty significant bailout just 4 years ago, right? And it continues to be highly supported by the government. Now, automotive sector in general tends to receive bailouts, but I think we know that NIO is a fairly small company in China, and we know that this happens repeatedly in a lot of different companies. So it's just a question also of scale of what might happen maybe in other countries, just doesn't have the same impact as it does in China. And I think it's worth noting that these are huge markets and huge industries. And even a company like SAIC, which is an SOE in China, it's a company that has major exports to Europe, for example. So even though perhaps it doesn't look like this company is that successful and is struggling, it still has a very big impact on trade. And I think that's just worth keeping in mind. I think it's the same issue as the social welfare subsidies. They still have a large impact on trade. So no matter what the reasons are in China, and I come to this as sort of a China scholar, so I'm very sympathetic to the political economy challenges within China, which I think are far more complex than sometimes the narrative gets to. I think that it's still worth recognizing, and perhaps I think it would be welcome if the Chinese government were more upfront about recognizing that this does create some political imbalances, at least in other countries, and it is a reason why we see such trade tensions increasing. So I think I'll leave it at that, and I know that we want to leave a few minutes for Q&A. So,
IIaria, thank you very much indeed. We have about 15 minutes left, so there is time for some Q&A. I'm going to throw the floor open now for anyone who wishes to raise a point or ask Simon, Xinquan, or IIaria a question. Please go ahead. I don't see anybody at the moment.
I'm happy to ask a question if that's helpful.
Please go ahead. Yes.
I thought Simon's data is super interesting, and I noticed that there were all the areas that are affected by sort of Chinese trade policies, or policies that affect other companies. The areas are the same, but am I right interpreting that there's an increase even though the same areas are affected?
I'm going to give the floor directly to Simon to answer that, and in the meantime, I hope some of you will be looking for questions to ask. Simon, the floor is yours.
So thanks, IIaria. The way to interpret that chart was that if you think of the measures which were introduced between the last TPR and today, the sectors that they cover, the pattern is pretty similar to what was the measures which were introduced between the last TPR and the TPR before that. So it's a sense that the distribution of the measures hasn't seemed to have changed that much, which counters the sort of narrative that when it comes down to the allocation of subsidies, how much has changed despite apparent changes in industrial policy strategy. That's how to interpret it, I think.
Thank you, Simon. And the floor remains open.
I'll ask a quick question, if I may.
Yes, please, Ido. Please do.
And so thank you very much for these two presentations, which I think were really insightful. And it's always a pleasure to try to absorb the thoughts that you've put together in making these presentations. So thank you very much. I want to go back a little bit to what Simon Evenett was saying about structural trade surpluses in relation to overcapacity, because he quoted, I think, notably Secretary Yellen's comments. And those comments, of course, are more macroeconomic than trade. The interesting thing about trade policy, I always think, is if you want to be good, you have to know both law and economics and then combine the two. But my point is this, is that when we are looking at some of the overcapacity problems through a trade lens, we're inevitably drawn towards less optimal use of trade defense instruments, etc. And so my question really is, and so I do actually want to compare this with the case of Germany in the Eurozone or the case of Japan in the 80s, etc. That if you succeed in rebalancing the economy macroeconomically by using macroeconomic instruments to reduce the saving rate of people or to ensure that they don't feel they need to save as much because there are adequate safety nets in place, etc., that could lead to a rebalancing of the economy that would take a lot of pressure off trade instruments. So, and that's really what I think a lot of people are thinking about, which is how can we find a way through the trade tensions? You're going to have alternatives potentially in a number of months, which are either tariff-based, they could be monetary-based, but the most elegant solution is really a macroeconomic policy that the government owns, which leads to a rebalancing by having less savings and more consumption. So I really want to ask if that isn't actually the most elegant way through to resolve what otherwise will be a continued period of stress simply because of the size of the current Chinese economy. It's much larger than Germany ever was or Japan. It's a very significant size. So I would want the Chinese to celebrate their success as they've moved up the value chain. But if we can do it in a balanced way, I think it would take a lot of stress out of the trading system.
Ido, thank you very much indeed. I remember in the first Chinese TPR, low consumption rates were already identified as a potential problem. And one of the solutions suggested at that time was an improvement in the financial services to improve, to contribute to a lower savings rate. And you're making much the same point at the moment. Is there anyone else who wishes to raise a question before I give this back to Simon to answer? In that case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give it to Simon to answer this question. And as we are preciously close to running out of time, after Simon answers the question, I will in reverse order ask IIaria, then Xinquan, and then finally Simon to wind up the meeting. Simon, the floor is yours to answer Huda's question. Oh, sorry, Bob. Sorry, Bob. I've just seen Simon has just pointed out that your hand was up. Please,
quick question,
please.
It's a quick question and following up on Hito. What's the role of the IMF in this versus the WTO? That's something I rarely hear discussed, and yet I agree with Hito that this is a big issue. Trying to fix it with trade policies generally does not work. Is there a role for the IMF in trying to solve some of these issues? Thanks.
Financial services. Simon, the floor is yours on this question.
So thank you very much, Hito and Bob, for these questions. I mean, we've known ever since the 30s that you can try and solve problems with trade instruments or macro instruments. And so this again comes back to us. Yeah, I'm sympathetic to the idea that perhaps we could change these structural imbalances through macro policies, but it seems that this is not the choice which is being made in Beijing. So we are then left with structural imbalances which are somehow being relabeled as systemic excess capacity. And maybe that's actually a misservice for exactly the point that Hido and others are making, which is that if we kept to the language of macro imbalances, then maybe it should go back to the finance ministries and to the IMF rather than being seen as a trade problem. Yep.
Yes, I agree. Are there any more questions that anybody would like to raise anything? If not, I'm going to come back to you, IIaria, perhaps to do a bit of a final few minutes on Chinese trade policies and measures. The floor is yours, IIaria.
Oh, thank you so much. I think here the real experts are Professor Evenett and Professor Tu. So I'll leave the more space for them to comment on this. But I would just say, I think it is reflecting on the latest comments that were made. I think it's true that where we're, I think, grappling with trade problems, but also internal domestic policies, and not just on the Chinese side, right? I think we're seeing a shift in how industrial policy is viewed, green industrial policy, right? Significant spending on the energy transition. We're still recovering from the shocks due to COVID. Hard sometimes to disentangle what is still reflecting that shock and what is not. But I think it's clear that we're not headed into a world where these issues are going to be resolved on their own. And so we are going to see more trade instruments being deployed, trade defense instruments being deployed globally. I don't see politically the Chinese government being particularly willing to discuss what may be macroeconomic imbalances or overcapacity or whatever you want to label it, right? But there is something going on in the Chinese economy which is being reflected in some certain trade tensions. And I think there's also a broader sort of geopolitical element to this, which of course is not the WTO's purview, but I think is influencing all this and sort of in the background of a lot of this. And I thought, the slides on, actually Professor Tu's slides on the rebalancing of China's exports was quite interesting in that respect. But so I think I'll leave it at that, but I think there's some really big issues at play. And I think ultimately it's probably going to come down to certain political negotiations as well, rather than, I think, as has been said, it's probably going to be, we're going to see a lot of suboptimal trade responses, and hopefully those will lead to a more broader sort of comprehensive discussions about what to do about this, because we may just end up in a sort of very suboptimal sort of outcome instead.
You're muted.
I'm sorry, the floor is yours, Xinquan, for about 2 minutes. I was muted indeed.
Thank you. I agree that for China, at least, we need both macroeconomic policy and also external economic policy to deal with the problems, internal problems and external problems. So this, as I said, the consumption-driven economic growth should be further strengthened. And in terms of external economic relations, I think China also should try harder to develop international economic relations, integrations with partners through various channels. Not only trade, not only exports and imports, but also overseas outbound investment and inbound investments. So and also I believe that China has reached this stage to invest more overseas. It has happened, actually. It is also happening. So. But the problem is, I think other countries, including the US and the EU, should welcome China's investments. I believe that FDI could stimulate more mutual benefits. So we need, as I said, we need both trade and investment, and also people-to-people communications. As I said, China has offered this unilateral visa-free policy. I believe this is a great policy. So, but as I said, there are some restrictions on China's overseas investments. I don't think this is necessary, and this is a good policy. So anyway, I hope that we can address those problems together. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And I'm going to finally give the floor to Simon. And Lou is with us. Lou, if after Simon you wish to say a word or two, please go ahead. Simon, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Clem. In reflecting on this conversation, I see some interesting differences. One, clearly in how countries like to fight recessions, right? We have a clear difference in crisis response between the Anglo-Saxon countries maybe and how China likes to do it. By the way, there's also a difference between how China has responded to the current downturn and how it responded at the global financial crisis when it did a huge stimulus package, the largest as a share of GDP. So that, I think, is a big difference which we may want to reflect on, and we may want to reflect on why China finds that it's unwilling to do a sort of debt-driven stimulus package, and perhaps it's more worried about the levels of public debt than in the West are, and then they, who knows who's making the right judgment on that score. But still, I see a difference there. Where I see some interesting similarities is in the argument that national security is the rationale for all sorts of industrial policy to bolster domestic manufacturing. That seems to be very similar. And also, if Richard Baldwin's numbers are right, then we see the two largest economies in the world needing the world trading system less and less and less as their export dependence goes down. In which case, that makes me worried a bit more about who's going to stand up for the system if the two biggest players won't. So let me just stop there. I think there's a lot of important systemic questions to reflect on for all of us, raised by China's interesting TPR.
Clemens, there is one question from.
Hang on. I've just had a last-minute request from a Mr. Zhao to say something. Please, Mr. Zhao, very briefly. The floor is yours. Well,
Clem, you are muted.
No, I'm not muted.
Okay.
He's not taking.
Sorry. Yes. Okay.
You are okay.
Yeah.
Please, the floor is yours if you want to say something very briefly.
Yeah. Thank you. I just have one very brief comment. We all know that trade policy review mechanism is of great importance in monitoring and enhancing the transparency of the WTO members. And I have just three preliminary response to the questions raised today. The first one is that what enables loss-making firms to continue commercial operations? I'm not an economist, so I could not provide any analysis or possible answers to this question. But what I can share here is that China has company law and bankruptcy law and relevant regulations and domestic legislations. As Professor Evenett pointed out, this is not a China-specific issue. We are welcome, or we are open to further academic discussions in this field. The second question is that what non-subsidy reforms could be pursued to improve the business environment? As a MOFCOM, we think this is a very good question and very constructive question. But I think the subsidy used here might be different from the term used in the SCM agreement. That's why some database like WIND has a much larger number than the notification. Some incentive measures provided by central and sub-central government of China are inclusive and generally available for qualified companies. So I think these measures are not specific and not as the term identified by the SCM agreement. And from the government side, what I think is that both from central and sub-central level, China has been exploring new ways to improve business environment. As Professor Tu just mentioned, China has introduced and implemented some further opening up measures since last review. Just name a few: tariff reduction and further market access for foreign investors, and facilitating personal movements and as well as data flow. Lastly, I would like to say that China is always willing to hear the comments and suggestions from both academic and WTO members. And China will hold a seminar focused on the economic and trade policy outlook of China next month, just before China's TPR. In this seminar, we would like to share some more information on current performance and outlook of China's macro economy. I think this can cover some interesting issues raised today. And we will elaborate on more opening up measures in this seminar. And I hope in this practice, we can share more information with WTO members to further enhance the transparency. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Shao. Lou, would you like to say a few words in closing?
Thanks, Clem. Sorry, I was late for something family. I didn't plan to speak, but maybe just 2 words. Madame Zhao, who just spoke, is the director in charge of TPR from MOVCOM. So for the audience to know. And I just want to probably refer to what Simon said at the end of his closing statement. I think that's a kind of a warning, I think, to us all, and also the purpose of the TPR, which he said that if the 2 big players, China and the US, kind of reduce their usage of the multilateral trading system, that would be a kind of a disaster. And that's not his words, but my words. I think quite some years ago, Pascal Lamy was also saying this, and he was very blunt, saying that there are 2 members in the WTO who have the choice, the US and China. Of course, with their power and their status, they could do so, but probably that's the last thing they should do. I think that that's if they starting to do that, that would probably be the biggest hit on the system. And we're already seeing that coming incrementally. And we have China under serious transformation, and we are also seeing a kind of turbulence and with the coming US election. So let's hope that that won't come, and we should work together to avoid that situation. So I just want to conclude with that. Thank you, Clem, and thanks to the whole panel. Thank you very much.
And I'm going to close this meeting now. Thank you very much to the panelists, Simon, IIaria, and Xinquan, for your contributions. And thank you very much to all. Bye-bye.